Can you start? Well, we'll figure it out.
We know
Hey,
we
Michelle.
started.
We started. Okay. I was going to ask if you can start it, but yeah. Anyways. Hey, Michelle, how you doing?
Oh, welcome to the podcast, Mikki. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're doing part two of how to run really well, but now this is going to be how to run really well off the bike, since we know a lot of our listeners are of the triathlete variety and not the standalone run only variety. So we're going to delve down into, yeah, what does it take to run well when you're probably, I'm guessing we'll sort of focus 70.3 and Ironman-ish, but we might there might be some things that we will cover that will also apply to sprints and Olympics, since we know we have some listeners that are maybe doing sprints and Olympics as well. So number one, so often get athletes coming to me saying, I want to run, I think what I need to run better off the bike is to run more and to run faster. How about
All the
you?
time.
All
Yeah.
the time.
No, I mean, I had a consult just yesterday with a new athlete. It's a sister of a local athlete that I am coaching here. And she's young. She's in college. She's coming out to do Hawaii 70.3 for like her first race ever, right? So she's never done a triathlon. It comes from collegiate swimming background, right? So you're like, so she has like capacity to swim. And but her sister was concerned that, she wasn't training enough to like get through, like as of what I'm teaching the local one that I'm coaching here, right? She's like, teach my sister the anyway. So we're on this consult call yesterday, and I was trying to emphasize to her how important long bike rides are when you're like prepping for a long race. It's going to be longer than 6 hours for her, right? And she's coming from like a sprinting background in the pool. So I'm like, so we're really looking at like changing your physiology altogether. The way to do that is, increase your volume on the bike so that you're fitter. And I said, this will be the key to your success and having a good day at Hawaii 70.3. And she goes, oh, I would have thought it would have been the run, right? So like
Mhm.
from this total newbie standpoint mindset, it makes a lot of sense that like when you look at the demands of that race, you're like, oh, running 13 miles there at the end, like you have to be really fit on the run in order to do that. And so it is a really common misconception
Mhm.
that it's all about run fitness. And then the picture that I painted for her was, yeah, but if riding 56 miles kicks your ass because you're not ready for it, you won't have the ability to express your run fitness. So like you
Mhm.
could be really fit on the run, but if you've used up your bucket of energy on the swim and the bike and you get to T2 and you're exhausted, I don't care how fit you are on the run,
Mhm.
you won't run to your ability level because your energy will be too low. Like you've diminished it all. And so like building up your fitness on the swim and the bike. So for her in particular, the swim was not, it's not going to be an issue, right? But she doesn't currently have a bike. Like, well, you should get one, right?
Mhm.
Because it's
Yes.
time. That race is in about 16 weeks, and you need to go get a bike and start riding it for as long as you can. Easy. And yeah, and once I explained it to her, she's like, oh yeah, I guess like that makes sense. It's just like it's running in triathlon is like part of triathlon. And while there are elements of run training that we can bring over, the ability to run well in a triathlon is not as linked to your run fitness as it is your swim and bike fitness and your fueling.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, maybe we want to, it's kind of a two-pronged discussion here. One is the fitness, the base fitness, and making sure that you have you have the base fitness and that you are cognizant of your fitness going into the race. A lot of times we have potentially athletes that believe that they have or they have desires, right? They have outcome desires of the race. Does their fitness support that? And then can they, a lot of times maybe it may not support that. So then can you dial your race execution, maybe not back, but can you execute a race that will allow you to get to the finish line as fast as possible with nothing left to give? That's the goal, right? And trying to delve that out appropriately. So there's sort of the energy system. Well, it's, I guess energy system is combining nutrition too, but I guess maybe for our discussion purposes, there's like, execution and base fitness, and then there's the nutrition component, which absolutely, if you cannot fuel yourself to get across the line, then that's number one, right? You can't even come close to executing even 10% of your run fitness if you can't fuel the bike appropriately and then the run. And so how do you feel about kind of subdividing or taking one approach? They might kind of go back and forth. I don't know. How do you feel
Yeah, no,
about?
I think it really does. I think the two go together. And so like some of the things I wrote down like when thinking about this podcast and like, well, this topic in particular is that when we're looking at a 70.3 or an Ironman, the whole thing is looking at it from through a lens of how much energy is this going
Mhm.
to take total, right? To get through. Like you're asking your body to do this swim and this bike and this run that's going to last, let's say, like 5 hours on an ideal, amazing end for 70.3, but up to 17 hours for, an Ironman. So you're going to ask your body to exercise for 5 to 17 hours. And it's so common that athletes don't really think about what is required. What am I asking my body to do as far as converting energy for this particular event, right? And how expensive is it going to be, right? So like we would never just go to a car dealership and be like, oh, I want like that, and that really nice car with all the upgrades and all the fancy stuff on it, right? And without asking about how much does it cost and how much money do I have in my bank account and how much money am I bringing in, right? So like if I have a lot of money in my bank account and I have a really good stable job where I'm bringing lots of money in, then I can afford that really nice car, right? And I'm going to buy it. But if I've depleted my bank account, so I don't have much in the bank account, and I just took a part-time job somewhere, and so I don't have like a huge income coming in, then it's like if I try to buy that nice car, I'm going to go bankrupt. And I mean, we can look at that the same
That's
way
a
with
very
the run in a triathlon, which are like, so what you have in your bank account is like the glycogen stores in your body, and how efficient is your whole body? How efficient have you made your body at converting energy? That's like your fitness account. And then on top of that, I can be bringing in carbohydrate while I'm swimming and biking, not really while you're swimming, but like throughout the race in the beginning, I can be bringing more in, right? And if the combination of what I have stored, how efficient my body is, and how much I bring in supports the the energy that's required to hold the pace or the watts and the power that I want, then I'm going to cross the finish line really happy.
right, right.
But
As
like
long as
figuring all
Yeah,
that out first is
right,
like the key piece of it.
right. As long as, although I was going to say, you have the fitness, you've done the training, right? You've done, the caveat is I have myself have experienced, because I'm a fantastic fueler. I've shown up to races Ironman and I've maybe not had the fitness, but because I can fuel really well, I can still get to the line, maybe not as fast as I normally would or wanted to, right? But I joke, I used to be able to off the couch. And now I don't mean completely off the couch, but with a fairly low training load. But because I could fuel it, and I could delve it out in a smart way, I could still do things that a lot of people would be like, oh my God, that's
Also
insane.
goes with our analogy of like the
Right.
car, right? So even if I don't have a huge bank account, right? I'm new, I just graduated college, but I got this job that's paying me $150,000 a year. Well, like I have enough coming in that I can still pay my monthly payments for that car and I can still afford it without going bankrupt, right? So like
Yeah.
it's a
There's,
combination of the two, and that's why we said in the beginning, can we separate
right.
these out? Like, well, like not
Well,
really.
right. Yeah. 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 So, well, maybe dive down. So common problems, maybe start with when we don't have the run we want off the bike. And I see this a lot with athletes, even though, we've executed, maybe and with my athletes, and I'm sure you do this with yours, you always probably give like heart rates and watts and like perceived effort. There's a race plan, especially for Ironman and 70.3s. And so when you don't have the run that you want, the first thing I always tell my athletes is like, give it some time. Time does bring the emotional component down. And then you can be more rational about looking at why we didn't execute the way that we wanted to. So going back and looking at your data, and for every one of my athletes, I ask them, as best as you can remember, put in what you ate and how you felt, as specifically as you can. And I swear it's like pulling teeth sometimes. Like, well, why? I'm like, because this is, fueling is the fourth discipline, literally. So, do you do that with your I'm assuming you do that with your athletes. It's pretty standard. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, the thing
yeah.
is, I mean, I feel like I'm encouraging that from the very beginning. And even like this young gal that I like, my parting words to her, like at the end, was like, I'm encouraging you to read labels, read grams of carbohydrate. Do not look at total calories, look at grams of carbohydrate. Like, get used to reading those. The good news is because she's new, so there's a couple things. Because she's new, she doesn't have preconceived notions. Like, this is, I feel like this concept is harder for athletes that are older and have been in the sport for a long time because they're like, well, this is how I've always done it, right? Versus somebody who's brand new and she's gonna listen to me and be like, well, like that coach who seemed to know what she was talking about, she told me 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour and read the label. And so like,
Mhm.
I think this gal's actually going to do that. So I feel like doing that from the beginning and having the plan from the beginning. The biggest issue that I come across with the athlete at the end of the race is they had the plan to start with, because like we've literally been drilling this for months, but then like at the end of the race, they're like, when I saw my bike bottles, like I still had half that bottle left. So
Yeah.
like they went in with a good plan. I was trying to drink all of that, but I didn't end up drinking it all. I didn't even realize I didn't drink it all. But you know, there's probably 50 grams of carbohydrate that were in left in this bottle that I didn't drink. So looking back at that is a
Yeah. Yeah, very, very common. And I mean, I'm sure had this too. It's like, well, at some point I didn't feel like eating. I've had
mm-hmm.
that. I just didn't feel like eating, and then I started to get sick, and I'm like, it's probably because you weren't eating, So yeah, and we always have problem solving. Like, well, if you don't want that thing that you had on your bike, or you get to the next aid station and you look at it's a buffet. Like, what can you eat? Because it's literally like that is going to determine how quickly your energy and if you can keep going and if you can cross the line in some cases. And so there's still, yeah, maybe you're right with some athletes, or there's this idea that I can overcome, like I can somehow magically have energy come to me and I can keep moving forward. I don't know. I don't truly understand the mindset. Like, I think there is maybe just well, for my athletes that have struggled, it's like they think they're not tough enough. Instead of, and I have to remind them, it's not about the toughness. Like, literally your body is just, it's failing. Like, it's in a state where you've either not eaten for X amount of time, and so you're actually ill, or maybe you ate too much because you tried to make up, or whatever, or you were eating the wrong thing, which is also very real. When we talk about grams of carbohydrates, I mean, there are different forms, and oftentimes over 3 hours, like, you do need different forms of carbohydrate. And I know liquids have become really popular and they work for some people, and other people it's a recipe for GI distress. So practicing, right? Number one is practicing to see what you can handle. And a lot of times it's hard to practice in exactly the race conditions, but yeah, it's so key to try to have the plan, stick to the plan. Like, just like you'd be sticking to heart rate and power, try as best you can to remember. And if it needs, if you got to set a timer on your watch to remind yourself, then do it. And then if it goes south, like, what's your backup plan? Because like not having a plan, or not eating, or, well, I just can't because I'm sick. It's like, well, then you're trying to force your body to continue on. And sometimes we've got 16 miles left, right? Or more, right? And, so yeah, it is absolutely a key component. So I know you had some notes that.
So, and when you talk about like the sick nausea things, a couple of things come to mind, and I'd be curious about how like how do you counsel your athletes through that? Like,
Mhm.
I felt sick, I felt nauseous, I didn't want to eat anymore. There's like three or four components of this that I would be like, okay, let's troubleshoot that nausea that you had that is preventing you from being able to take in the carbohydrates that are necessary for you to keep up the effort that you want to keep up, right? So the first thing I would think about is, are you dehydrated? Because like when we're dehydrated, if we're taking in more carbohydrate than we are liquids or fluids, then our bodies will have a hard time absorbing those carbohydrates that we're eating. So like that would be the first thing. And I might be hyper aware of that because like I'm in Hawaii where it's hot and humid most of the time. And so like dehydration might be a bigger issue for us here. Although you're at altitude and dehydration is the thing there
Yeah,
too,
that's,
right? So
yeah.
so that's always like my first thing is about like, let's look at the hydration, right? Like, is that playing a role in your nausea? The second thing is pacing and effort. And so I just know for myself is that when I spend too much time like or near threshold or like above threshold, the nausea that sets in for me because of the amount of time that I've spent working
Hmm.
at or above my capacity, and my body's like trying to shut me down. And so then like the second thing I'd be like, let's talk about the pacing, or let's look at the power, let's look at what your
Hmm.
heart rate was, like if we have that data. And you say like, if you were to slow down, your digestive system may work better. And that's just straight up physiology, is that when we're under high stress, I mean, in a sympathetic nervous system state, digestion shuts down. So like, of course, we're not going to be able to digest very well in that scenario. So hydration, pacing, and effort. The third thing, when you mentioned like the type of carbohydrate, I've experienced this myself too. I feel like you, I have a gut of steel. Like I feel like I've trained that a lot. Like I can eat just about anything. That said, I have, okay, so you know the new carbohydrate, like so Scratch High Carb and Morton and Precision Hydration, and like there's Stierker's another one that I really like, these brands that make these highly processed carbohydrates like the super carbs, and like they say that they're easier to digest and therefore you can get like 90 grams down per hour. Personally, for myself, I have found that to be true, that like if and when I want 90 grams of carbs per hour, going with one of those companies is the best call. The issue with those are that they're expensive, right? So I'm like,
Mm.
I don't want to spend, and some of them are like $4 per serving. Like I don't really
Wow.
want to spend like four
It's like
dollars for 90
ketones.
grams of carbs, right? You know, and you're just like, oh, it's like a lot, you know. And if you're doing that for, you know, like it's just it. I mean, you can end up having like a $20 long ride in just
Yeah.
training fuel, right? If you're trying to
Right.
do that. And so I tried to play the cheap game, and I bought some like I mean, I don't know
Maltodextrin.
these guys, and like
No.
I'm just gonna call it out.
No.
Like there was this company called like, I don't know, I think it's called like Formula 369,
Hmm.
and they are, I was on Instagram. I mean, like they advertised to me, and I'm like, oh, that sounds great. And their whole thing was 369, meaning that each scoop of their powder was 30 grams of carbohydrate. So you could put one scoop for 30, two scoops for 60, or three scoops for 90, like in your bottle. And that way you have this flexibility to adjust depending on the duration and intensity, and that you have total control over it. You know, and the concept just makes perfect sense. And their point, what they said was, this is the exact same formula as like these super carb formulas, but it was like half the price. And I'm like, I'm in, right? So like I bought a package of like a big thing of this thing. Oh my God, it was not the same. Like it was, I put 60 grams in a bottle, like two scoops of that. So not even the max that they told me that I could do. Drank a bottle, and I was nauseous and ill in a way that like I should not have been. Like with 60 grams of Scratch High Carb, I would not have been nauseous and ill. Like I can
Yeah.
easy get 90 grams down and hardly even notice it, versus this stuff, like it was not the same. And so that's an unfortunate truth. Yet like you can't drink like high C fruit punch, even though there's tons of grams of carbs in there, and expect to not be nauseous on that. So like if we're looking at the third piece of that, is like, what type of carb are you consuming? Like unfortunately, the expensive super processed ones tend to be the easiest ones to absorb. So on the days when it's most important to get carbohydrates down, finding a source that you can actually do that with. And I would say my athletes who complain the most that there's no way they can get 90 grams of carbs down are the same ones who are not buying the high carb because it's too expensive.
Mm.
And I get, right, like, and it's like, I understand that. Just know what you know that, right? And they like, well, then you can't push as hard because like you're taking in fewer carbs. Like there is no power without carbohydrate. So like if you're not going to take as much carbohydrate, you're not going to be able to push as much power. And if that's a trade you're willing to make, then it is, right? Like, and that's just how it has to be. And then the fourth and final thing that I think doesn't play a role with everyone, but plays a role with some, and I've talked about this a little bit before, but is your preconceived notion about carbohydrates, just generally speaking. And so for women who are, it tends to be women, I'm saying women, but I guess it could be men, but I rarely ever hear it. I've heard this from one guy, mostly women. There are carbohydrates make you gain weight, right? And I don't want to eat carbohydrate. And they pull that mindset into even their training and their racing, right?
Hmm.
So, like, if the big picture umbrella is carbohydrates make me sick, carbohydrates are bad for me, and like you genuinely really believe that, then when you're taking in carbohydrate, the chances of your body accepting that without any pushback, like it's going to go down, right? Anything,
Yeah.
if I believe this is bad for me, I will manifest it being bad for me. So there is a degree of that where people are like, oh no, I'll get sick if I eat that. And maybe they've had an experience in the past of being sick, but then you're like, well, let's look back at your hydration, the type of carbohydrate you were using, your effort, and did those contribute? And finding a way to believe that this is helpful for you instead of this is harmful for you. And like that baseline belief
Mm-hmm.
plays a role. So anyway, that was just like my response to like, that's how I respond to my athletes when they're like more carbohydrates. I feel nauseous and sick. Like I believe you that you feel
Mm-hmm.
nauseous and sick. So like, let's look at these four components and see which ones we could stand to modify so that you can take in the required fuel so that you can push the power or pace that you want to push.
Right. So have you ever had an athlete that you don't believe it is their thought process, but they actually do have GI issues that would prevent them from eating?
Yeah.
And what
And
do
so
you
that's when
do?
we,
Yeah.
with the, we
Yeah.
look at like
Different
the
sources.
hydration, the types of carb, like
Yeah.
specifically the type of
Yeah.
carb. Like, so some people will have a harder time like digesting fructose. And so you're like, make
Versus
sure
like,
that yours doesn't have
yeah.
tons of fructose in it or minimize that. But that also could be like, and I don't know, like, I hesitate to overspeak here, but I'm going to say this anyway. But I should know. Sometimes those are symptoms of a bigger problem. Like, when your digestive system is not working, it is a sign that in a big picture way, your nervous system isn't balanced in the
Hmm.
healthy way that it could be. Right. So, like,
Hmm.
I believe you that your body is not absorbing the carbohydrates as effectively as someone who's more relaxed. And part of the reason why, so like, I wouldn't say 100% that applies to everyone. But what I would say is that I've seen athletes who have major digestive issues, and I believe them. They really do. Like they're puking, they've got diarrhea. Like, I mean, these are real, like
Hmm.
their body's telling them, I don't like that. I'm not absorbing
Hmm.
that. But what's so interesting is that, and they swear to God, it's not stress. But that same athlete goes on vacation, and like all of a sudden, that same food that was making them sick and ill at home when they were in that stressful environment that they're not
Hmm.
admitting is stressful, on vacation it's fine. I don't know, I felt fine, I felt great. Like, oh well, maybe let's look at the difference then of like
Yeah.
why in this situation your body absorbed that food just fine and in this situation it didn't. So it may not be the food, it may be the environment. So, and that may be beyond our like,
Yeah. Well,
right, like that's on the athlete then to figure out.
right. Yeah. Yeah. There are situations that I've helped athletes with, and encouraging them to work with a registered dietitian nutritionist on more like food allergies. I had an athlete that went to do like a FODMAP, and found a ton of what she was eating outside of training was really wrecking her gut. And so it definitely limited then what she could eat in training, as well as trying some different products that the first few times didn't work. But then as she cleaned, I hate to use that word clean, when she optimized her out of training diet and kind of improved her GI tract in general, then she was able to take in more appropriate amounts of carbohydrate in different types of forms than what was traditionally working. So I do think there's, in that light, they were also working on improving the amount of fitness they had under their metabolic efficiency point. So I know it's not as popular these days to talk about fat burning and your substrate utilization, and maybe that's a podcast for another time. But I think there is still a role, endurance performance, where if you're fueling your outside training and you're fueling your in training with huge amounts of carbohydrates, like you're degrading the amount of well, overall health. I mean, maybe if you're young, if you're 20, 30, maybe you can do that and not have a lot of ill effects. But I mean, if you continue to do that throughout your life, I mean, it's a recipe for diabetes. And so I tend to think that, you know, there's a place for improving. Your outside diet will affect your performance. Absolutely. Like, protein and appropriate carbohydrates and enjoying the sugar when you need it, maybe even the alcohol, but, eating like an asshole, quite honestly, does not work well, especially for masters athletes. And so I just put that out there. So
It does work for young athletes, doesn't it?
it
I mean,
does.
like, yeah, like athletes in their 20s are like human garbage disposals. Like, they can just eat anything and it just
Yeah.
goes poof. And it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, wait till you turn 40. That is not going to fly
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So for my athletes, I'm pretty honest with, I believe in fueling with carbohydrates appropriately. I am not a high carb. Well, if you can get in more carbs and it literally does not affect your GI system, then that's fantastic. If you cannot, then we have to figure out ways to improve your fitness underneath that crossover point, to get you faster without needing to take in more carbohydrates, and that's a viable path too. It might not be as quick of a path for that athlete because they have to sort of double. I mean, they're working on two fronts, right? They're trying to improve their fat burning, while getting faster, and sometimes it just takes a little bit longer than if an athlete that's, for myself. I mean, even though I followed that philosophy no keto, but lower carbohydrate outside of training for most of my life, and then fueled appropriately with carbohydrate during racing, literally never had a GI issue ever in 12, 13, 14 Ironmans. I don't even know what bonking is. I've never and I did do a lot of fasted training. And so,
Congratulations. I know what
yeah,
bunking is.
yeah. No, I mean, I do, but it's like I can count on one hand episodes. So
Can I ask you a
my, yeah,
question? And this is going to go into like, and if this works out, like, it'll, like, anyway, if you were to describe yourself, like, would you describe yourself as a sprinter or somebody who's really good at putting out high power for short distances, like when you need to? Or would you describe yourself more as like a diesel engine when asked to sprint, would likely lose that sprint? Do you know what I'm
I'm
saying?
de- I'm definitely a sprinter. Like I'm a closer, and yeah, in track, it's like if I could hang on to the shoulder, I could outkick even like people that were better than I was, like a better runner. So yeah, I'm
So that's
definitely a
really
power.
interesting
Yeah,
then that you don't bonk because, like, well, there's a couple things.
I'm a
Let's
weird
do a little bit of,
athlete. Yeah,
yeah, like, let's do a little bit of math. And like, and we're going to make some assumptions on this, right? But like, so let's say that you're exercising, and this would be like probably bike or run. The, the effort that you're putting out is using about 600 calories per hour, like just in energy, like that you're putting out, right? Which is like pretty standard. Like if you're racing, like you're probably burning about 600 calories an hour. And so then if we think about like so when you talk about the metabolic efficiency, if we talk about the crossover point, if you're doing that at exactly your crossover point, which means that 50% of the energy that you are consuming or that you're being
burn it.
converted is coming from fat, and the other half is coming from glycogen, then that means 300 of those calories coming from glycogen. And if we do the math on that to figure out calorie or grams of carbs with like 4 calories per gram of carb, that is 75 grams of carbohydrate that your body is using for that effort in the 1 hour that you're exercising at not max capacity. Like a 50-50 crossover is not your max capacity.
No, no,
So it's
yeah,
still even, I mean, and for a lot of people, that would be kind of an easy effort,
yeah.
right? And so it's
So
still 75 grams of carbs per hour, even at still kind of your easy effort. And so that's not a problem if you're going for like up to maybe 3 hours. It's not a
yeah,
big problem because you have enough in storage. But when you start
right,
going over 3 hours, when it starts not being fun
right.
anymore, it's because like you're lacking then in like muscle glycogen because you've used a lot of that storage because the exercise was more expensive than you thought. And then if you weren't taking in, like that's where the math starts to go bad. And you're like at 5 hours, you just start walking because you literally don't have the energy anymore to produce the muscle contractions that allow you to keep running,
Right, right, right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So some of the numbers that are quoted, in terms of if you know what you're burning at different effort levels, it's actually pretty low. It's like for most people that want to avoid GI issues, it's like 10 to 30%. But that's like the bare minimum, I would say.
Like,
So if you have
explain that
600,
further.
so most of the replenishment calories are in the 10 to 30% range. If you're going to exercise for an hour and you burn 600 calories, like you can't take in 600 calories in an hour at any kind of like moderate, even top of zone 2. So most of the numbers that are thrown around, and it varies by person. I think it's I think I just saw it in Bob Seebohar's metabolic efficiency book. I'm looking at it, it's beside me. He quotes like 10 from all of his lab testing with a metabolic cart, it's 10 to 30% that people can take in, and not have GI issues. Now, again, that a person might be way higher than that. So those are just, yeah, the numbers. And of course, that's
Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you can only take in like 30% of what you're burning, um, like if it's 600 calories per hour, that's only 200 calories per hour, and just about everybody can do more than that.
yeah.
So like that's
Those are
the
the
thing I
minimum
don't
those.
understand.
Well, so in that theory, right, as you get fitter, under your in your fat burning, you need less and less. So I think the overall theory is that, as you get faster, at under that crossover point, then you won't need as many. I mean, because you're right, like as you go harder, if you are pushing big watts and you're at closer to your VO2 max, then yeah, you're going to be burning way more calories. And I don't remember the ratios of like if you're in zone 2 versus zone 5, but it's a huge difference.
So like by the time
Like,
you're in like zone 4, you're 100% carbohydrate, pretty much.
but total calories too. Like it just takes way more energy to move, right? To do those big, whatever it is you're doing. And it's not sport specific necessarily. I mean, I think probably is given muscular contractions, but yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah, no, it's pretty fascinating that I mean, I used to do 3 hours MAF, right? So MAF and your metabolic crossover. So MAF was developed. It's not phylmaffetone, right? It's a maximum aerobic function. And he did a lot of testing on heart rate testing, but he also did test against a metabolic cart. In his own words, like the MAF is close to metabolic crossover point. That's kind of the theory, right, of using the MAF number, which is usually close-ish to the fat max. Fat max, it depends on the person again. Fat max usually is a little bit higher in terms of percent VO2 max than metabolic crossover point. But yeah, so training by MAF and eating low-ish carbs and then training with carbs, I never had to. I'd go back. So I use the same protocol for every Ironman and never had issues. And I'm trying to think of like how many calories, I was always on that 1 bar an hour, like 1 bar of like a scratch bar, a picky bar. So what is that? Probably like 280 calories. They vary.
The bars are sort of, I think in grams of carbs, so they're like 35 to 40 grams of carbs usually,
Yeah.
like in a bar. So then my question, so like if you were my athlete, I'd be like, and what were you drinking?
It's just regular scratch. Like I never did high carb anything.
Yeah.
And
So
with that, it's like, and then on the run, it was like 1 shot block per mile with scratch. That's it.
yeah, that's amazing. So that to me, if you're not failing on that carbohydrate plan, I would be like, you have a really high
Yeah.
fat efficiency, or
Yeah.
your metabolic efficiency is
Yeah.
really high if you're not failing on that plan. And by the way, for anyone who's wondering, like, how do I get my metabolic efficiency to be
Yes.
higher? I mean, typically it's low aerobic volume. Like the more volume you do, the more like
And
you're like that's how you're
yeah.
going to do that. And then you can manipulate it with diet and with
Yeah.
training intensity.
Yeah.
So, and what people need to know too is that when you go do like the 45-minute high intensity Peloton session and you call that like your bike training, there's benefit to that, right? It is not the metabolic benefit of like training the energy system that you're going to need for, a 6 to 10 hour race, right? There's benefit to that 45-minute Peloton session. It's not going to increase your metabolic efficiency. It's not helping you go longer than 3 hours, but that doesn't mean there's not value to it. It's just a matter of understanding like what are you targeting? What are you doing?
Right.
If you want to
Right.
be more metabolically efficient, you manipulate that with your diet, like what you're consuming in and out of training, and with your training intensity and volume. And the more volume you do, by necessary, right, you're going to go lower intensity. And doing a ton of that will improve your metabolic efficiency and the way your body's converting energy. And then, I mean, this whole podcast is supposed to be running off the bike, and all
Sorry.
we've
Yeah.
really
I
talked
know.
about is like
Well, it's
energy consumption,
nutrition.
but like
I
that's what
know.
it is, right?
It
Like
is.
that's what it is.
It is. And so I didn't do a Met test when I was racing really at the highest end of my capability. And maybe, there's something I'm always interested in self-evaluation. Like, did I limit myself? Right. I was never afraid of carbs, but I knew what worked for me and I was able to drain the tank when I needed to. So I figured, like, why mess it up if it's working? But I did do a Met cart when it was about 3 years. I was at 40. So, for example, people start with your MAF of similar to your age. It's 180 minus your age. So my MAF would have been about 140 at the time, right? Yeah, 40. And I went in, and when I started training with Lucho, he was like, "Oh, let's lower. It's like probably 130 now, 135, because most people, it's usually lower." And so I went in to do the test, and my crossover was at heart rate of 150. Still at 40 years old and not training as much as I had been training in my mid 30s. So I would guess that, yeah, through combination of diet, and there could be some genetics that's rarely talked about, for some of this stuff. And so maybe I just got lucky too. There's that. So yeah, one moment my dog is destroying a quilt. I will be right back. One moment. See if I can. Uh, how do I mute this thing? Mute? No. I'll be right back.
Yeah. In the meantime, while Mickey's gone, I'll talk about. So there was a podcast that Jack Kelly did with Fred Funk a couple weeks ago. It's called the Triathlon Hour, and I highly recommend listening to it. Like if you're able to um, download that one. But they were talking about this concept of like when Jack was asking Fred about his training and his running off the bike. Because so what you have to know about Fred Funk is a professional triathlete. He's a really strong biker. He's a really strong swimmer. He tends to be like in a front pack getting off the bike, like in T2. If there's 5 or 6 guys that are lead pack, he tends to be one of them. And he tends to not run as well as some of the other guys off the bike. Right. And so, like, when you look at an athlete like that, you would say, like, all right, for him to improve, he needs to maintain his swim and bike and then be able to run faster, like with those top guys. Fred has Dan Lorang as his coach, and Dan Lorang is an incredible coach, super smart, right? And is going to look at all of this, and they do all of the testing. So in this podcast, he's talking about his limiter is that his VLA max is too high, right? And so they're talking about this measure of VLA max. And what is that? And that's the amount of lactate that you are producing. So like the VLA max is the most lactate that you're producing at like a really high level, right? Like so if you're sprinting, how much lactate can you produce? And you can measure that with a simple blood test. And so what was interesting is that like I knew and understood this concept because when I would do like a step test on the bike and like when I'm pushing 220 watts, my lactate level is like 12. Like, so no wonder that's not sustainable, right? Like that, like it's like not going to be because, but other athletes, when they like, if I had a lot of other athletes tested and like some girls who are like really strong riders or whatever, and at 220 for them, their lactate's at 4.5, right? And mine's at 12. So you're like, so the way that my body is converting energy and what that means is basically like when your VLA max is high, and this is what Fred said, that his VLA max is too high. So they have
Mhm.
to train. So he specifically has to train in a way to lower his VLA max. So like, but by the way, if he was trying to sprint, like if he was trying to win like a pursuit on the track, you would not be trying to lower your VLA max. But when you're trying to run as fast as you can at the end of 3 or 4 hours, like you don't want to be producing like tons of lactate. You want to be able to do that without that. And the reason is because the higher your lactate is, the more glycogen you're burning through. And so his point was the fact that my VLA max is as high as it is an indicator that my body is using a ton of energy to put out that effort. And so his training is like shifted so that the outcome, so there's a lot of his training where he's not going as hard as he possibly could, because when he's doing intervals at a really high level, he's like maintaining that high VLA max. And so, in order for him to improve, he has to employ intensity control. Even when he's doing like threshold intervals, he needs to be really careful, stay below that, because his aim is actually to lower VLA max. And so, and when I did my testing on lactate, I'm like, oh, no wonder Ironmans were so hard for me. Like, no wonder, like I had such a hard time. Like, it just, my body was using so much glycogen to put out the bigger efforts. And that goes for like, even if you're in a hilly race, and so your average watts aren't that high, but you did all those hills you have a strong effort, or you were constantly passing people, or you were putting out lots of energy. The expense of that, it may allow you to get through the bike still okay, but then it shows up on the run because your bucket of energy is lower than what it could be. And that's what Fred says. So like this year, what he and Dan are working on together is lowering his VLA max. So, but in a way that still allows him to swim and bike at the level he wants to. But if he can lower, that's basically like lowering the energy cost of your race pace so that you have more energy left for the run. Because and this is a concept that I wanted to bring up too. Like, if for an athlete who's wondering, do I need to improve my run, or do I need to improve my swim and bike? Right? Like, so if you're not running as well as you want to be, then I think what I would as a coach look at, and I'm just curious like what you would look at, but like, okay, what's your open half marathon time? Right? Versus, and then like, so if you're just doing a half marathon, how fast can you do that? And then what is your half marathon in a 70.3? I tend to look at, if the difference is about 10 minutes, you ran great in that half Ironman, right? If it's 20 minutes, like if you can run 20 minutes faster without swimming and biking first than you can in a 70.3, then you say, okay, you're either like, somehow the swim and the bike are too expensive. And that's either that you're going harder than your fitness allows, or you're under fueling. But either way, like the swim and the bike are too expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, 70.3 is easier to solve, in my opinion, as a coach, because fueling is less of an issue. I can have athletes execute really well 70.3 effort and not have any issues. And it's the Ironman jump, because there's more of a, again, not to, the metabolic cost is much higher when you go from, 5 to 6 hours is hard for a person. But then jumping to like 13, 14, 17, for most age group athletes that aren't doing 8 hours Ironman or 9 hours Ironman. But yes, absolutely. I tend to, yeah, use very similar. I think 20 minutes difference between an open and a 70.3 run off the bike. Oh, and most of the time, for the athletes I worked with, it's bike execution. I do work with some strong swimmers, but the swim, tends to just be what it's going to be. I have my athletes swim fairly consistently. So what usually comes down to is over either not having the bike fitness that we desired, or what I usually see is actually just riding too hard. They just went too hard.
Or
Um,
spiky efforts. Do you see the spiky
Spike,
efforts?
yeah,
Like, we can look at, like, if you look at the variability index
yeah,
on a file after a bike ride, and
yeah.
that's, you can only look at the VI if you have power data for the ride, right? But look at, and Training Peaks will calculate this for you. But if you look at the VI that is on the file at the end, if it's more than like 1.03 or so, it means that you did a lot of spiking and coasting and spiking and coasting, and that is a way more expensive way to ride, as far as if you're looking at how much energy did it take your body to do that effort, than if you're more just economic and you're steady across, which means not going uphill as fast as you possibly could. Right? Like, I'm going to just sit down and I'm going to put myself in the right gear, and I'm just going to spin my way up this hill, keep myself controlled, and then keep pushing on the downhill, which you can do because you're not super tired because you didn't push over threshold on the uphill. Then, and that tends to be a less expensive way to ride, which allows you then to run closer to potential, versus like when the variability is high.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the fitter you are, the more you can burn more matches, so to speak. But if you are kind of stretching your fitness capabilities for the race, for whatever reason, whatever you're rebuilding, you took some time off, you just didn't get the training in, just knowing that those efforts potentially going to be more costly. And some races have their hilly races. I mean, my favorite races are hilly races. And so you just have to dial your expectations back on what that run might look like off the bike. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. I'm trying to think of other examples of, not to go back to Ironman, and this is a little bit different. So I guess there is one other component that I don't think we touched on that I do think is important, and that's just muscular strength for Ironman. I think that it's something that maybe I have forgotten about because I tend to coach a lot of athletes they're not newbies, they've done this for a long time. And so we've gone through a lot of build cycles, and they're strong. They're strong in what they want to do, right? They're, what's the word I'm looking for? They've got muscular, what's the word I'm blanking on? Muscular endurance, right? They've done many Ironmans, many 70. But I think it is a reality for newer athletes, or if you're coming back again from injury, or maybe as I become more of a masters, I progress into masters, and I coach more masters. The breakdown and the damage that we're doing, you can mitigate it to a certain extent, right? The muscular fatigue by being stronger. So this is assuming that you executed the swim and the bike well, and you had the appropriate fitness, and then you executed to that, and then to be able to continue to maintain the effort that you want to put out on the run, making sure you are strong in run specific strength areas, so take that for what do you ever, I mean, do you agree, or is that something you work with your athletes on, or have you seen evidence of that?
I
I'm
have
sorry.
seen
Yeah.
evidence. Yeah, for sure, I have seen evidence of that. I also wonder, and this is something that I don't know, right? This is a theory that I have, or like, I don't know. I don't even know if it's a theory or just like a question. Muscle is your storage capacity for glycogen, right? So, like, the more muscle you have, the more storage
Hmm.
capacity for glycogen you have. And so,
Hmm.
there may be like a two-prong benefit
Yeah.
to having more
Yeah.
muscle. Is it like, so you're not going to break down as early because you're actually stronger, but also your like
Yeah.
muscle fibers are where glycogen is stored. So if you have more muscle, you have more storage. It's like that analogy we talked about in the beginning, where you have your like your fitness account, your bank account, like how much do you have? If you have
Yeah.
more glycogen stored
Yeah.
because you have more muscle, then it like that's another reason that it makes sense to me that you would be able to go for longer. I'm curious, like, so because I think that strength is more complicated than we know, especially when your purpose is endurance athlete, right? So like I struggle some with this because I have like a personal belief that for sure muscle strength is important, especially for women, especially for aging women, right? Like for health reasons, for longevity, for like a lot of things. Being strong is really important. And having muscle and not being afraid of muscle, like really good. It may be because like the athletes are younger, but like there are a lot of very good. I mean, you look at elite marathoners, like none of them are especially strong
Hmm.
from not the way that we look at strong, right? Like they're excellent at their sport. You look at a lot of the professional triathletes are not spending a ton of time in the gym lifting weights. And so even as I say that, I'm not saying that I don't recommend amateur athletes lifting weights, right? Because like our goals, at least in my mind, go well beyond your performance.
Hmm.
Like I want athletes to be healthy. I want them to remain healthy. I want them to be healthy like after they finish endurance sport. But I'm not convinced that like specifically lifting heavy weights is
No. Yeah.
imperative for endurance performance, but it is imperative for health. Like it's a
There's
blend, right?
yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't believe that you have to lift heavy to be good at endurance. I think they can be at odds with each other. I
So
think,
I just want to like really
yeah.
be
Oh, yeah.
clear about like when we're saying strength and muscle is really important. Like I'm with you, but I feel like
I
being
should have,
clear about what we mean about that strength and what does that look like. It's not maxing out like your squat and your deadlift is
no.
not the way to get better at biking.
What, yeah, no. And so what I was trying to, it's muscular endurance is really what I mean. And so that means, so for athletes, I'm a huge fan of hill repeats, like getting strength involved in the thing you want to be good at. so cycling or running, so big gear work on the bike, and we do a lot of hill repeats, for the people I work with. And so I do body weight strengths, so squats, air squats, wall sits. We do some single leg stuff, which I know is kind of, I know with Lawrence's some. I mean, so I don't I'm not a PT, right? And if someone is working with a PT, I say do what your PT says. However, I do work with athletes that are in their 70s, somewhere's upper 70s, and so we do some single leg balancing stuff. We calf strengthening, like just step down, step ups. So things that are, you know, trying to improve the functionality of the muscle tone and strength of the, like lower legs, right? So I've got a lot of athletes that have the Vasa. So we do kind of swim specific strength with the Vasa, but obviously the Vasa is for strength on the swim. So I try as much as possible to incorporate movements that are more closely related to the sport that they're in. And some athletes don't need it as much as others. Working with younger athletes, I think it's less important. When I start working, my 60-year-old, 70-year-olds, I really encourage them to include it. Like that needs to, if you want to run faster, even open running, not even off the bike, you got to be able, your muscles and brain need to work together, neuromuscular, and your body, your aerobic system might be fine, but your muscles, if they're not able to do the thing you want it to do, then you're not going to get faster. And so it does become more closely intertwined as we get older, I think,
Yeah,
at least from my experience.
100%.
So
That's
yeah,
my answer too to a lot of like
yeah,
athletes when they're asking me about strength training and should we incorporate strength training things that typically if I have an athlete's in their 20s or 30s, I would be like, just as I say this, take it with a grain of salt because I don't mean it for everyone, but I'm just saying for you, if you don't have a ton of extra time, it might not be the
yeah,
best way for you
yeah,
to spend your time, right? So if you
right.
have a lot of time and you like lifting weights and you're 30 years old, then absolutely like go for it. It becomes increasingly important. And so like for the 40 and 50-year-olds, I would be like, make time.
Yeah,
Find your
yeah,
time, you know what I mean? Like prioritize
yeah.
this in a way that like I wouldn't say to a younger athlete. So again, it's one of those things. It's like, it depends. I also think that like what you're talking about with hills, that we can bring that in. And this is really like a Brett Sutton philosophy, like the way of training where
Hmm.
he doesn't have his athletes at all
Yeah,
in the gym,
no,
but he will specifically design. So for swimming, what you're looking at for strength training is put your paddles on and do long sets of paddles and making sure that your form is good so that you're, using your lats and the paddles are increasing the surface area and making it harder. So if you're swimming with paddles, we'll do a thing on swimming at some point. And so this will be the only thing I'll say about swimming. If you're swimming with paddles and it doesn't feel harder, you're doing it wrong, right? Like you will be faster. You should be faster. But if it doesn't feel harder, you're doing it wrong. And then on the bike, doing your big gear work. I mean, I have had so much success training. Well, personally, I've had success. And then also watching my athletes, like the ones that are capable of handling a high volume load of sort of like sweet spot work in a low cadence scenario, right? Where you're pushing 50 to 65 RPM. A lot of times uphill is just the easiest way to execute that. So again, you do it on hills, but you could do it on a flatter road into a headwind or like on your trainer or whatever, just load the watts up kind of high and slow the cadence down and just grind that out and get to the point where you can handle a solid amount of that. And then like your 70.3 bike split's going to be super solid. And you don't, but what I also tell athletes is like the ones that I'm training with in person right now, I keep encouraging them when we're out riding, like gear down, gear down, gear down, like look at my cadence, match my cadence. Cause they all like want to spin. I'm like, and there's a reason to spin and there's a place to
yeah,
spin. So even as I
for
say
sure.
this, like I'm not saying spinning is bad, but when you're training for a 70.3 and trying to gain like bike specific strength, then using a bigger gear and pedaling in that uncomfortably low cadence much of the time is a really good way to get there. But then I tell them like, look, when you're racing, this is not how you're going to race. Like this isn't the fastest way to ride. It's not the fastest way to climb. It's not the fastest way to race.
Mhm.
So like, don't confuse what I'm saying and be like, oh, Michelle thought that I should be like pedaling at 60 RPM for the whole
No,
70.3.
no,
Like, no, that's not what
no.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then same thing around the run, like doing hill repeats on the run, I feel like is like a really good way to get run specific stronger in a way that translates. And then you don't have to spend a lot of extra time in the gym if you don't have time for it or you don't love it. you can do those three things specifically while you're swim bike running and get stronger in that way. That's how I did it in my 30s. And like when I was racing my best, I was not lifting weights. But I will say now that I'm 51, lifting weights helps me feel better overall. I feel healthier. Like
Yeah.
it's the right thing
Yeah.
for me at this point. So
Yeah.
it depends.
I didn't do a lot. I mean, all I did was climb on my bike, when I was racing well for me, because where I lived. And so most of my rides were Z3 into threshold climbing, doing whatever gear I had. Sometimes you're geared out. So that's what I did. And then a lot of times it's Z1 back to town and do it again. And, was it the best? I know when I started working with Lucho, he's like, "Can you go down to the flats to ride?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not going down to the flats. This has worked for me. I will go climb all day and it's fine." And it usually translated, decently well. I think volume mattered to a certain extent, even if I couldn't be in the right quote unquote right zones all the time. But I know it made me stronger. I did, TRX work and like body strength work, body weight, planks, core work, but not a lot, a couple times a week. So, but now, yeah, well, actually, I've taken some time off, but I split wood for 45 minutes to an hour every day. So that's,
That's
you
legit.
know,
That's functional strength is what it
it
is
is,
because
it is
you're
functional.
performing a
Yes.
function.
Yeah. And heating my house. So yeah, I mean, anyways, I do think because it's not in the forefront of my mind, but I think it does become important, especially for those athletes that might be listening that are in our age range or above, that want to maintain run speed. You've got to work a little bit of some strength work just to make sure you can handle the volume and be able, if you want to run fast, right? We got to move the muscles in ways that support that. So
Yeah.
yeah. The
I feel
last
like
thing,
we've just done
go
a
ahead.
bunch of like
I know, random.
it
Oh,
depends
sorry.
things,
I know.
no, but I think like it's such a good point about like I'm not saying like that there's misinformation out there, but it's more like people misinterpret information that's out there, and so you'll
Hmm.
hear a concept like low cadence, bigger work on the bike is good, and then when you take that and apply it like in every scenario, you're not
Right.
likely doing yourself a service, but understanding like how and why and when this type of work is beneficial and for whom, then you can like take that information and apply it correctly. And then again with like your high cadence spinning, like why is that good and who is it good for and in what scenarios does it matter, and like when you understand that, then you're like I can apply that in the right scenario. And I think that's just in our society in general, we're missing some of that nuance and like ability to understand, or like people don't want to think that deeply about it. You know what I mean? Just give me the formula. Just give me the
Just give
formula.
me the
And I'm like,
formula.
well,
Yeah, I know.
it depends. How old are
It
you?
does.
What
It
are your
does.
goals?
Yeah.
What's your fitness level?
Yeah.
How much time do you have?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's so much what a coach does is helps people problem solve, right? Like we don't have the answers all the time. We have a lot of things that have worked for us or other athletes, and we certainly both you and I read a ton, right? And do the background work and we try to stay up on the newest, latest and greatest. But ultimately it kind of comes down to let's try some things and see what works and what works for you. Not to go back into nutrition, but I did want to also point out that if you are struggling with your nutrition, know that one, trying a lot of things, and like Michelle said, right, start to look at the labels, look at what carbs you're taking in. If something feels comfortable, say 50 grams an hour, then maybe the next ride you try 60. I would not suggest jumping to like 120, right? But also know that if you have struggled to run off the bike, that it's easier to get. So bike and run nutrition, not very different, but you can't use most people can't take on as many calories or carbohydrates specifically on the run as they can on the bike. So if you struggle with nutrition and you think that's why you're not able to run to your fitness level, and nutrition is the limiter, like know that you need to probably front end your nutrition on the bike and continue to, if you're Ironman, you're going to have to, well, even 70.3, you're going to have to start to fuel on the run to, or start, you have to continue to fuel on the run to a certain degree, to certain mileage, to certain, depending on how quick you are or how fast you are. But it's easier. Your GI system it's more able to take in fueling on the bike, both from I think a mechanical situation. There's just less jostling as well as a caloric expenditure typically. Usually, even if you're executing a really steady, stable effort, whether that's heart rate, pace, power, whatever, you're usually expending less calories. You're expending less energy on the bike than on the run. Run is more energy intensive. So I just wanted to, yeah, make sure we touched on that. If you are someone that's like listening and you're like, yeah, well, I'm doing all the things and I'm trying to take in, 90 grams on the run, or you might be able to. That's fantastic, but you might not be able to. And so if you can front load it a bit, that would be where I'd start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll do this as a little bonus for anyone who's gotten through this whole podcast. So we're about 65 minutes in here, 64 minutes in. If you're still with us, here's a little bit of like, and actually, I would be curious, like what you say. The advice, this is very general, and I vary it some for an individual athlete. Like if I know that athlete, then maybe we can like vary this a little bit. But generally speaking, if an athlete comes to me and says, how should I fuel my 70.3? What I don't do is give specific, like, here's the product you should use, or you should use gels or drink it or bars or whatever. Like, I'm like, I don't care what source your carbohydrate comes from.
Hmm.
Like, that source is up to you to decide. Like, and you learn that in training. Like, can you drink your calories? Do you need to eat them? Or do you love, I mean, I've got guys who are like, I love gels. I'm like, great, just keep eating your gels. And like, if you love them and you think they're good, great. You do gels the whole time. And there's others that don't. So literally, I'm like, I don't care where the grams of carbs come from. But I would say, generally speaking, take in 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrate, like while you're standing in line getting ready to start your swim, right? Like normally
Hmm.
they would have like a trash bin or something like right before you're about to cross the timing mat. So if you do that, 5 minutes before you're about to go and you take your gel or eat your chews or drink your bottle or whatever, right? And then you can toss your garbage right there before you go. 25 to 30 grams before you start the swim. Then 200 grams of carbs for the 56-mile bike ride, right? And that kind of goes for like, so if it's a per hour thing, you'll be taking in more if you're riding really fast. But also, if you're riding really fast, you're putting out more power, which means you're going to have to
Hmm.
take in like more per hour. Versus if you're riding slower, you're likely putting out less glycogen is required for that, but
Hmm.
the duration goes longer. So it's still going to be around 200 grams of carbs total for the whole bike ride. And then it's just the per hour part gets
Hmm.
shifted a bit depending on how long you're actually on the bike. And then so the 200 grams is kind of a lot to get in on the bike. Like you have to plan for that. Like that is not happening unless you're reading labels, you have a plan and you have easy to digest carbohydrate. And then what I tell people on the run is like typically go for 3 gels, or if you don't like gels, then go for, like whatever. But like 25 grams of carbohydrates at mile like 3, 7, and 10.
Hmm.
And then everything else is like you're mandated to take something from every aid station. I don't care what, right? That's where you're like, listen to your body, right? And if Coke sounds good to you, drink the Coke. If a banana sounds edible to you, eat the banana. If an orange is like, that sounds good, like your body is going to tell you what it needs. Take the ice, take the fluids. If you can drink Gatorade, drink it. If you're like, water sounds better, drink the water. Like that's where you're listening to your body in between those, but essentially the 25 grams of carbs 3 times throughout the run, plus whatever sounds good to you from the aid stations. When athletes do that, almost across the board, they finish and they're like, oh, great. I ran better than I thought I was going to, right? Like if you could do that, you're likely setting yourself up, and then you paced it well and you were trained well and you had all the other pieces in place. You're likely to have a good day if you follow that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I do the same thing. I leave it up to the athlete. I will give suggestions if they struggle with certain things or they ask for, ideas. The only thing I will add I don't know why. I tend to work with athletes that have a lot of GI issues, and that's interesting since I never did. So I've had to try and learn more, right? Because I am a trash can. Like I could probably eat a hamburger and still ride pretty hard. And that's just the way my gut is. I'm blessed, knock on wood, right? But I would say if people struggle to take those recommendations that you just gave and do it at shorter time periods, shorter blocks of time. And that might be more annoying because you feel like you're eating all the time, but it's easier for your stomach to take in the carbohydrates or the thing or whatever you're eating in smaller bits. A lot of times it's just simply that if you're going at a pretty high effort, that bulbous, thing that you just put down, your stomach is like, oh no, I don't want it. But if you were to split it up into smaller chunks and take it more frequently, it usually works out better. Not always 100%, but
Like the 200 grams of carbs is like spread out throughout the run.
yeah, oh
Like
yeah,
it's what
yeah,
you're
yeah.
drinking, it's what you're eating, it's in your gels, it's in your chews, it's in the bars, it's in like all the things.
A lot of times people they'll just be like, on the hour I'm going to do a whole bottle, right? I'm going to try to get a
Yeah.
whole bottle. And it's like, oh no, try, especially with the high. And again, I'm not as experienced with the high carb stuff because I never raced on it, but I would imagine. So back in when I was, racing at a higher level or at all, I was basically every half hour. That worked for me. 20, 30, depending on the race and like what the climbs were. um, but yeah, every 20 to 30 minutes, I'd have half a bar and probably half a bottle, sipping on whatever. And then I would transition to chews because bars are a little bit harder on the stomach, when you start to think about running off the bike. Um, but yeah, but
Yeah.
smaller
Like chewing
chunks.
in a race. Like I chewing in a race was just never something I wanted to do. In an Ironman I would, because I would be going
Yeah.
like slower. It would be
I
okay.
just don't
But
have yeah, again,
I could get
I'm
away with gels. I don't train a lot on gels, or I never did. I didn't train a lot on gels when I was training and racing, but I would race on gels and be fine. As
yeah,
long as I was hydrated enough, and I would have that. I would like, but anyway. Anyway, so like let's sum up then. So like this whole thing was about, I mean, supposedly it was about running off the bike. And if you notice where Mikki and I went with that the whole time was
yeah,
your energy bucket, right? So like the issue with if you're an athlete who feels like you're not running to your capacity off the bike, it's likely because the swim and the bike are taking too much energy from you. And so the best way to remedy that for yourself is not to run more and run harder, but it's to manipulate the way that your body is converting energy and do that through your diet and your intensity control and your volume of swim and bike training so that you get to T2 with enough energy left over to express the run fitness that you've built, right? So like that's
that's
really
it.
the key
Yeah,
of it, right? So like,
yeah,
and so even if I mean, I've seen athletes who are injured and didn't do a ton of run training, and so they're like, I don't know how this race is going to go because like I've been injured. I haven't run longer than 6 miles. Like, but in that time, we just took their run training time and we made them swim and bike more. And it's been amazing that as long as they in the past have been capable of running 13 miles, you're right, like at some point you were able to do it, then even if you haven't done it recently, but you're super fit swim and bike, the chances of you running, like surprising yourself on the run, are really high. If your swim and bike fitness are high and you fueled yourself well and you pace yourself well, you'll get to T2 and be like, I don't know, I feel great. And then you're in a place where like you have choices, like you can actually push because it's there versus like when you're out of energy, you're just out. And there's no, like, it's not like you're not tough enough. And we kind of touched on this earlier, like there's a
yeah.
difference between like being like not being fit enough and being depleted,
Deleted.
right? And
Yeah,
when
it's
you're
yeah,
depleted, you're like, it's like your car is out of gas, right?
yeah.
And you could have the nicest Maserati that you were driving around, and like that, there's no gas in that Maserati. Like it's still a really good car. And by the way, as soon as you put gas in it, it'll go
Gonna
again
be
and it'll
yeah,
go fast. But if it's out of gas, it doesn't matter how nice the car was.
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
How
absolutely.
prepared that
That's
car
a
was to go fast when it did have gas. If it doesn't
yeah,
have gas, it's not going to go fast. So
yeah.
yeah,
I have several many athletes in the past that have come to me. I also tend to get athletes that have, worked with me and then they go away and then they try other coaches and not that the other coaches injures them, but somehow they might get injured and they come back and and they're like, I got these two Ironmans and I can't really run. And they're like, can I do it? And I'm like, well, let's see. Basically doing the same plan, right? Like we work on what they can do, bikes, swims. We run when they're ready to run a little bit here and there. We sprinkle it in just to keep that run form and the neurological, neuromuscular connections. But I had an athlete do, this is back when Ironman Boulder was still around, and I think his longest run was maybe 9 miles. And this particular Ironman boulder was also brutally hot. I think it was over 100. And he placed quite well in that race because he had a lot of fitness, and we fueled and we hydrated and well, actually, right before the race, I said, you have to take it down about 10 notches today because it's going to be about survival. And he did. Well, and he was running. He ran most of the marathon, with some breaks to refuel. And, I can't remember what his place was, but he went on to do Kona, and it was fantastic. And so I have many examples, I'm sure you do too, of people that, for whatever reason you can't run, or maybe you don't want to run that much. You don't, I have to run well. You really need to, yeah, get really fit in whatever mechanism, and ideally on a modality that is also, as we talked about in the last episode, running is really hard on the body. And so doing like a 4 or 5 hour long run, like that's going to take a lot out of you.
Yeah,
Whereas you could run 45 minutes off of a 5 hour bike. That's a way better session for Ironman preparation than going out and doing a 20 mile or whatever. Um, so yeah,
yeah,
I don't know where I was
totally
going with
agree.
that. My puppy is definitely ready for us to be done. So
Yeah, show the puppy, and
um,
then we'll call it. We like
okay.
to see dogs on our
She
podcast these
she's
days.
she's eating the bed there. Oh my gosh, can you see the mess that is also my bookshelf? I need to file these books away somewhere.
Yeah, but see, at least you
Um,
have books. You're reading books, so good job, Mickey.
I
We
have
would
a
all
lot
be
of.
better off if people read books.
Well, that is
We'll leave
that
it
is
there.
true. But anyways,
All
thanks for
right.
following along. And yeah, if you guys have more specific questions, I'm sure both of us would field any questions you have, and we hope it was helpful. But it does come down to energy systems for your running. And yeah, if you have approached if your open marathon, your open half is close to your Ironman or 70.3 PRs, then maybe it's time to step away and focus on, getting that run a bit faster so that then you can run faster off of the bike down the road. So, all
All right,
right.
cool. Well, we'll see you back in a couple weeks with a new topic.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks.